Well, that didn't last long. Hi, I'm Scott Ott with Bill Whittle and Stephen Green in this episode of Right Angles, brought to you by the members at BillWhittle.com. Men, the economic recovery, which of course we refer to here at Right Angle as the Obama recovery summer.
Yes.
Anyway, it has just really gotten going, and things are starting to go good when I'm suddenly starting to read more stories about how it could potentially take a downturn. And there are two particular ones that I want to ply your minds about today. One is a survey that came from a website called bankrate.com that's used as a source for financial information from the Wall Street Journal, USA Today, and others. And they did this survey, and they asked the American people what they thought the greatest threat to the economy was. And coming in at number 2 was, I don't know, with 14% of the people who said, I don't know what the greatest threat is. Coming in at number 3 was 9% of the public said terrorism was the greatest threat to the economy. But coming in at number 1 by a plurality of 43%, Steve Green, was the political situation in Washington, D.C. And let me just ask you about that first. Are the American people so caught up in their Fox News and their MSNBC that they attribute a greater threat to the economy from politics than from other kinds of more economic related things? Or are they onto something here?
Oh, they're definitely onto something. American people are very smart. We may not be able to agree on much, or at least not very often, but wow, this nails it. And think about the list of potential threats to the economy. It's a mile long, and yet you've got this huge plurality. You said what, 43%?
Yes.
That is a huge plurality of people agreeing on the number one threat. Now, I'll tell you what it is. We have a structural spending problem. It's huge, and I just read a report a couple of weeks ago that a debt overhang slightly bigger than the one we have now can produce a drag on economic growth of 1% to 2% a year. And what's really bad about that is we really need to grow our way out of the structural spending problem. But instead, we're going to have a $1 trillion deficit this year with no major war, with full employment, with record revenues. We're going to have a $1 trillion, essentially peacetime, robust economic growth deficit. This is intolerable. And if we had a sane, functional political class, they would get together, Democrats and Republicans, and hammer out some kind of compromise, maybe the way Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich did with the Balanced Budget Act in 1996, 97, whenever that was. It wasn't a perfect law. The budget was never quite actually in surplus. We had Social Security income covering up the shortfall. But the fact is that we had two guys, whatever you thought of them personally, and I don't think very much of either one of them personally, who did sit down and hammered out something that was actually pretty darn good. It's certainly better than we have now. And instead of any serious people from any serious party getting together and saying, hey, this is a threat to all of us, Democrat, Republican, Independent alike. We've got to be serious now. We're going to get probably a spending orgy from the Democrats that's going to pale in comparison to the spending orgy we just got done with from the Republicans. So yes, the American people are right on the money, Scott.
Yeah, Bill, Steve may be onto something here, because in addition, that same Bankrate survey found that growing percentage of Americans are actually reducing their own personal spending and increasing their savings. They say not near enough, but this is kind of a bellwether for people realizing that times are good now, but they don't go on forever. The other bit of economic news that I saw was CNBC conducted a poll of 10 leading economists who predicted that growth in 2019 would slow down to 2.4% annually, and that by 2020 we would potentially be in a recession. And they attributed this to 3 different factors. Number 1, trade wars and tariffs. Number 2, the Fed's rate hikes. And number 3, the diminishing effect of the what you might call the Trump tax cuts. Bill, if political divisions are that big of a threat, and if perhaps some of the president's own policies are that big of a threat, if this guy wants to get reelected, do you think he needs to tweak the direction of his administration?
So basically what you're saying is that economists have projected a worst-case scenario where Donald Trump enters his reelection year with an economic growth 2.5 times better than Barack Obama's ever was during his 8-year period. Is this the bad news that we're supposed to be bracing ourselves
yes,
for?
But you know how people are. Once they've enjoyed something,
the biggest threat to the American economy is Paul Krugman. And the reason
the New
that
York
Paul
Times
Krugman,
columnist?
yes, the New York Times distinguished professor of economics at the University of New York, who throughout the entire Obama administration kept talking about how no, debt is great, fantastic, fantastic, fantastic. When Trump was elected, we may remember on election night, or I think it was maybe the next day, the stock market took a hit. And Krugman said, when asked, "How long do you think this economic depression, of the stock market, may last?" And he said, first pass answer, forever. Turned out he was wrong by a day, forever and a day. Next day, it was up higher than it was the day before. And the reason I say that Paul Krugman is the biggest threat to the economy, is because you get into theory. When something becomes as complex as economics, you begin to get into the levels of theory where you really are talking about how many angels can dance on the head of a pin, or making the step-by-step argument that proves conclusively that an elephant can hang over a cliff with his tail tied to a daisy. These are the kind of things that happens when you get something that complex and you get so deep into it. So Krugman and the rest of his people are, in fact, the biggest threat to the economy because of the debt. The idea that you know more about economics than you cannot spend more than you make forever. You cannot. It's not possible. These are pretty simple concepts, and everybody understands them except for geniuses like Paul Krugman, who advise other geniuses like Barack Obama, who give us things like a 1% economic growth rate on a good year. Now, Donald Trump, of course, not a genius, not susceptible to the advice of other geniuses, is basically playing his own tune, and we're seeing 4 or 5 times the growth that the geniuses were able to muster over 8 years. So draw your own conclusions. But to me, these guys are not as smart as they think they are. And they're certainly not as smart as they say they are.
Bill, can I throw something in here? Because you reminded me of something. Milton Friedman, the guy we should be listening to instead of Paul Krugman, he said that everything we actually know about economics, we teach in Econ 1. Everything else we make up.
Right.
And Paul Krugman has forgotten everything you learned in Econ 1.
Right. Collateralized debt obligations. Well, what a fantastic economic concept. Works well on
right up until it doesn't.
Paper.
Well, I think that because economics is driven more by what people think than by any concrete thing that exists in the economy, this is one of the greatest arguments I've ever heard for small government, libertarian-esque, constitutionalist conservatism. It's the idea that we don't want any small group of people to have too much sway over the economy, because once their minds are swayed, they move in a definite direction that drags the rest of us with them. And so that's why things that, like the Federal Reserve can be so dangerous. Things like the New York Stock Exchange can be so dangerous. It's the more where you've got more eggs in one basket and a handful of people to make those decisions that make the economy a much more dangerous thing. The toughest thing to do on the part of an average citizen who's, got a couple of grand in a mutual fund and hoping for a retirement that's not completely dependent upon Social Security, is to remain cool when everybody else is losing their head, to continue to move forward as if we were going to find ways to solve our problems, and to not give in to the catastrophists who predict that anytime things are up, they must be ready to take a deep plunge. Yes, there is a cycle to the economy, but those giant potholes and those giant mountaintops in the economy would level off a little more if we had the decision-making power spread across millions of people instead of a handful of people in Washington, D.C. And if all of us were able to sit back and be a little bit more aloof about things and say, you know what, nothing is as bad as it looks when you first see it, and nothing is as good as it looks when you first see it. Just keep a cool head, sit back, be consistent, save some money, so to make up for the times when the clowns in Washington, D.C. screw things up really badly. But also, don't put all your hopes and dreams on some politician who you think is going to fix the economy. That's not the answer. You need to take care of yourself. You need to take care of your own family within local communities. The local community and the local school district have to fund themselves. I just take this down to the local level as much as possible, and it keeps us all from being vulnerable to a handful of kooks who are swept away by their passions or by the lovely Paul Krugman. For Bill Whittle and Stephen Green, I'm Scott Ott. Thanks to the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible.